Hola a tothom. Tenim l'honor d'estar acompanyats per el doctor Patrick Manning. És professor d'Història del Món a la Universitat de Pittsburgh. Ha dirigit molts centres de recerca en World History i és un dels fundadors de la World History com a disciplina. I ara estem aquí a la 20ª reunió de la World History Association i el professor Manning ha tingut la gentilesa d'atorgar-nos una entrevista. So, Professor Manning, hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
Speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So my first question would be, you wrote in your book, which I found extremely helpful for me to get around the discipline and understand how it got together and everything. You said you like history that fosters more, that pictures more the interaction rather than the dominance of different parts of the world together. And you're a specialist in African history, and you said that no world history can be serious or it can be suspicious if it doesn't include Africa. Mm-hmm. So could you elaborate?
Yes, okay. So the key to the notion of dominance, or my concern about the notion of dominance, is that it might be a pursuit of what is the most important essence in history. Okay, so according to this approach, you look for the greatest of the great men, the most powerful of the civilizations, the crucial innovation that made all the difference. And so a lot of history is done in that way, but a lot is missed as well. And so what the contribution that world historians can make is to emphasize the interconnections amongst regions, amongst topics, so the way in which social history influences economic history, or religious history influences political history, and the influences, the interactions amongst time periods as well. So an earlier time period influences a later time period. You can't do it the other way around, but on the other hand, you can interpret the past in a way that's different. And then to refer especially to the African side of things. So I began my work studying Africa, West African history, with an interest in economic history of the French colony of Dahomey as it was then, Benin as it is now, to see to what degree at the beginning of the colonial period the existing economy continued, or to what degree were things transformed completely by the French who took over. So there's an interest in interaction and the functioning of a local economy, but on the other hand, the influence was from the outside. So I wrote the dissertation. It covered the period 1880 to 1914, and so I said, that's right, the French didn't make that much of a difference. This was a pretty well-functioning economy. It continued to function well. Then I thought about it for a few more years and wrote the book based on it. And the book covers the period from 1640 to 1960. So back early enough to include the slave trade and really the times before the slave trade became serious, and then to follow it all the way up to 1960. So just the reason for going through all of that is to say that when I thought about it in longer terms, I decided, in this case, the interactions make a huge difference. That the impact of the slave trade in the 18th and 19th century really did a lot to limit growth in the area. And the operation of the colonial system really collected a lot more in tax revenue than it invested into the country. And so looking at things over a long period of time, I found a lot deeper interaction than over a short period of time.
At the time that you were finishing your dissertation, it was the time of all the African independence movements.
Well, yes. Actually, the time of all the African independence movements, or late 1950s, early 1960s, is when I decided to go into African history. dissertation was finished in 1969, so yes, we're still in the independence movement. The book came out in 1982, so anyhow, the perspectives do change as you know, by 1982 we were already getting into structural adjustment programs and so forth that put African economies under control of the international banks again.
Right.
So, yeah, so you know, because I can look over several decades, it's interesting to see the way in which history and approaches to history have changed.
In the years.
Yeah.
Recently in the H World Network, there has been some comments on world history reaching its climax and then beginning to ebb and beginning to decline in different universities across America. Would you agree this is the case, or what is your?
Well, let's see. What about world history? It can be instruction, right? So introductory level instruction in world history, this is one thing. Advanced undergraduate instruction in world history, this is a second thing. So that one is definitely growing rather than shrinking. We're beginning to get upper level courses in the United States. Graduate level, it's been changing very slowly, but nonetheless expanding, I think. But one reason why people might see world history as peaking and then declining is because there isn't just one coherent field as world history. There's so many subfields and so many dimensions to it that study is going off in various different directions. So big history is getting a lot of attention now, you know, thinking in terms of the natural sciences and thinking of very long periods of time. And so world history as a discipline, as a tight-knit group of people who work closely together continues to grow very slowly. World history as approaches, emphasizing thinking across disciplinary lines, thinking much more, not just comparatively, but interactively. That, it seems to me, to be growing throughout the historical profession and everywhere. So I tend to be a little more positive than most people on H.
Okay, and what about, okay, so this growth is happening not only in the United States, but also outside.
Yeah. So I've been especially interested in that. You know, I became very active in the program to get world history into the SISH and therefore to work to help form the organizations that would enable that to be possible. The World History Association was already there. European Network in Universal and Global History founded right about 2000, 2001. I went to their first conference was 2005. And I think that's right, it might have been another conference. But it was the Leipzig conference in 2005. But then we had several more big continents. Okay, so my first trip to China was in 2008. I came here along with a colleague from Japan, Shingo Minamizuka. And we met at Nankai University in Tianjin, just an hour from here, and formed the Asian Association of World Historians. So that was the first step in this. Shingo Minamizuka became the president of that organization, he still is. They had a very successful first conference in Japan in 2009, and they'll have a second conference in Korea in 2012. So, of course, Asia is a huge place, and it's really so far just Northeast Asia that's active in the Asian Association of World Historians. But and I remain on the board of the group as a founding person, although I'm slowly receding into the background here. But they include missions to Southeast Asia and South Asia and Western Asia to try to draw people from that whole region into the Asian Association of World Historians. So there's that group. And then I participated in a meeting in Nigeria in 2009 to help to found the African Network in global history. So the institutions aren't quite as strong, and also travel monies are greatly needed to get people together for a conference in Africa, and universities are short on money. So we had to postpone the first meeting of it. But probably in September of 2012 there'll be a continental meeting of African historians of the world. The closest that we got to really experiencing the world historical view of world history is the meeting in Amsterdam, the SISH meeting last August 2010, where we had something over 20 historians from Africa, Latin America, Asia, Europe, North America, meeting together, mostly staying in the same hotel, and to have the first conference of No Guisto, and also for each of the continental groups to meet with themselves and then meet with each other to think about possible collaborations. I mean, it was the most exciting thing. So world history grows up in different ways in every continent. You know, it's got its own history, its own university system or systems, its own political concerns. While there's you could say a fear that it's something dominated by North American ways of doing things, and that's an understandable fear. On the other hand, you know, the idea of understanding the history of the world is logical enough. You and your fellow students in Barcelona figured it out right there, right? And so this is the dominant phenomenon. You know, people considering global ways of looking at history as well as just national stories.
Because actually, well, there can be this rivalry between national histories and world history happening within the universities, and that sometimes can be cumbersome for the development of world history.
Yes. No, because it's practical things. Who gets to offer the main introductory course? And sometimes, so it can be you know, practical, organizational conflicts, or it can be philosophical conflicts. You know, does history really belong to the nation? What's the essential level where historical phenomena take place? But you know, by thinking of myself as a world historian, I do want to argue that there are some historical phenomena that are world historical. You know, where the process itself takes place at a global level. And the example for this that I usually use is comes out of my own experience as an African. I was wondering about, especially about civilizational dominance and racial discrimination. There was a time in about the 1890s when waves of racial discrimination took place. I learned about this first growing up in the United States, but then I learned after that in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Asia, even in Latin America, where there wasn't such a formalized racial discourse, that black people were fundamentally removed from positions of office and from positions of influence in major institutions, and this just happened all at once around the world. And so the local explanations can't be satisfactory. There's some larger pattern there. So that's the argument for global causation, if you want, at some point. But I don't want to argue that that's the way to do history. Quite the contrary. You know, there are other sort of phenomena that are really at the national level, or there are really formative patterns that exist at the community level. And so So I've sort of redefined over time what I think world history means, and what I think it means is an openness to looking at historical patterns at all levels, from the biggest and broadest down to very specific points, interactions amongst them. So that makes the job even harder. But at least you can always find interesting relationships to work on.
You very recently published a book on the African diaspora.
Yes, I did.
What is this interest in migrations, and how do you correlate migration with world history?
I realize that I have been working primarily on migration for, in some ways, 30 years, because after I did my economic history in West Africa, I found that the slave trade had been very serious and had almost certainly caused population decline in the 18th and 19th century. So with that, I began studying the impact of slave trade on African population. And then that led me into study of the African diaspora. And then after that, I got interested in migration generally. So I did a book on migration in world history, and concluded that migration, there's a certain sort of migration where people cross boundaries of communities. So you do it where you have to learn a new language and a new culture. All right. So you did that in going to Catalonia. And that experience is fundamental to human life. People do that generally at a young age. When you do it, you introduce your own ideas, that is to say, the things, in your case, that you brought from Mexico to Catalonia, and then you end up in discussions and arguments with people there. Migration in this way stimulates learning. So it's one of those fundamental things about the human species that makes us keep learning and developing new ideas, is the fact that we have people migrate from one community to another. So that's the migration thinking. But then back to the African diaspora, which is the question that you asked. The notion of the African diaspora became more and more recognized in the 1980s and 90s and so forth. And so I had a nice invitation to write a book about it, and I decided, yes, I could use this to make sense of a certain amount of my historical thinking. So one, I wanted to include the whole African diaspora, so movements not just to North America, but to Latin America, to the Caribbean, to Europe, to North Africa, to Asia. People went in all directions.
In Iran, I think there's also...
Yes, a significant cultural input into Iran and India and all the way up to the Caspian Sea. And second point was I wanted to make sure that Africa was included in this. So that's not a matter of how if that's the right way to define a diaspora, but I just feel that given the nature of the experience of people in sub-Saharan Africa and of sub-Saharan ancestry, that one needs to study the interplay of people. So Africa itself has changed dramatically as a result of these migrations overseas and back, and it's interesting to watch the cultural changes, political changes over, I chose 600 years from 1400 to the present. And I organized the book in chronological terms to look at that whole area for 100 years or 200 years and so forth, emphasizing what was interacting or common amongst the areas, rather than do the history of the Caribbean and then do the history of North America. And so some interesting things came out of that.
And about this book right here, you wrote about 9 years ago.
Yeah, in 2003 it came out.
It's a very, it's like a companion, a world historian's companion. Do you have a...
Yeah, so I began directing a program in world history at Northeastern University in 1994 in Boston. and had the remarkable experience of being able to teach 2 graduate courses each year for most of that time. It was arguably the first program really that made world history a major, principal course of study. We had, in the time that I was there, some 15 doctoral students managed to complete or get near to completion by the time I left Northeastern in 2006. But also the program ran into a lot of difficulties, shortage of funding, skepticism about whether it would work well, and just the inherent difficulties of doing the work. So this book is a description of my experiences and an argument for what ought to be considered at the advanced level. So for people who are teaching themselves, many teachers have to teach themselves world history, but especially for people who are in programs of graduate study. I have to say that's been the type of work that I've enjoyed most, is working with graduate students who are learning to do world history as their field.
It seems that most of the graduate students, at least in Punto Fabra, the big question is, so what the hell is world history?
So that's the name of the first chapter.
Yeah.
And that question will always be asked, it will never be. So the first section of the book defines world history, and then it provides a narrative of the evolving literature in world history over at least 2,000 years, to argue that there has been writing on world history for a very long period of time, even though it's only recently that it's developed as something that's widely read. That's one section of the book, and within that I have my argument about what is it that caused the changes within world history. But the next section of the book looks at disciplines, the various social science disciplines, and then especially natural science disciplines. So world history has developed in large part because new knowledge is showing up from other fields. So geology in particular, for instance. I like the example of all the work that's been done on volcanic history. They've now dated major volcanic eruptions back very nicely for 1,500 years. And so now we can start interpreting history in terms of droughts or political uprisings that came in the wake of a volcanic uprising. So there's an interaction between natural history and human history. So in any case, but we also have to talk about what's going on in sociology and anthropology and so forth. So world history is fun as a place where all these different fields come together.